can talk about it.
Okay.
Good to go. All right. For those of you who are on my team, this will be very familiar, but maybe a little bit more rehearsed. So an API is just something that sits between the client, the front end, your computer, the web browser, and the server, which is like the back end of websites where all the database stuff is and all the core processing is. Like when you're Googling something, you're typing in on the client, it goes to the server, gets the Google search results, and gives them back to the client. And so an analogy I like to use is imagine you're in a restaurant, you're sitting at a table, you're the customer, then you have the kitchen, and you have a waiter that goes between the two. The API is like the waiter, you are like the client, the customer, and the kitchen is like the server. So when you're at a restaurant, whether or not this is reality, the kitchen is going to do whatever they're told. If someone goes back there and says, make me a ham sandwich, make me 10 make me 10 ham sandwiches, maybe 100 ham sandwiches, they're going to do that. Kitchen's going to do whatever they're told. But, you know, realistically, the restaurant doesn't want to serve 100 ham sandwiches. So the waiter sits in between you and the kitchen and kind of acts as a relay, as like a middleman for your order. If you ask the waiter, if you ask the API to do something that the kitchen, that the server can't do, the waiters can say, like, no, we don't serve that. No, you can't afford that, or something similar. Before anything goes to the kitchen, the waiter's going to say yes, or the waiter's going to say no. And then if the waiter says yes, like that's on our menu, we have all of those ingredients available, the waiter will go to the kitchen, tell them to make the sandwich, and then bring that back to you. So back to that Google example, you'll ask the API for some search results. The API will go to the server, get those search results for you, and then bring them back. So the API acts as a middleman between the client and the server, just as the waiter acts as a middleman between a customer and the kitchen in the restaurant. Any questions on that?
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Everyone give it up for Andrew. That was amazing. Yeah, so that's essentially what an API is, right? It facilitates the communication between the client or the customer in Andrew's example and the server or the kitchen. So now we know what an API is, but you might be wondering, okay, what does it look like when I actually use an API? What does that information look like? And a lot of times, especially in web development, APIs use something called JSON in order to send and receive data back and forth across the client and the server. So all JSON is, it's a key value pair where the key is like the name of the data and the value is the actual information being stored. So let's just take a quick look at an example here. Here's an example of some JSON. And as you can see, first we surround our JSON in some curly braces, and then we actually put our data. So in this case, if this was about a person, the person's name would be John. John is 30 years old. John's age is 30, and John doesn't have a car. So the car field here is set to nothing or null. So that's kind of what JSON looks like, or JSON, excuse me. You'll see that a lot, especially as you're working with React. Most of the APIs you communicate with will be using JSON. So that's a quick example of what it looks like. And it's supposed to be like very readable. You can really easily parse or understand what's going on. So yeah, that's JSON. Oh, wait, yeah. Okay, now we know what an API is. We know how the data is sent back and forth between the client and server. But one more thing that the website that you're making your API calls to needs to know is what you actually want to do with your data, right? And so for that, we can use something called HTTP request methods. And you guys have probably all seen HTTP before. Whenever you go to a website, it's like HTTP:/, right? You've seen that. Basically, an HTTP request method lets the website know what you're trying to do with your API call. So you can do a couple different things, right? Especially when you're talking about data. You can create some data, you can just read some data, you can delete some data, and there are request methods for each of those. So let's go through each of these examples real quick. First, we have get. Get just says you want to retrieve or get some information from the server. Post, that says you want to create some data on the server. This one's a little weird. You can think about it like, if you're creating a tweet, you're posting a tweet. So that's what post is. It's just creating some data on the server. And then finally we have delete, pretty self-explanatory. That just says you want to delete some data from the server. Okay, so now let's do a quick look at some APIs. We're going to just do a quick example with Postman, which is, if you've read the onboarding, something you should have installed by now, right? So for this, we're just going to play around with an API. All I did here was I Googled public APIs because, I just want to be able to play with one. I'm going to click on this first result, which is just a huge list of a bunch of APIs we can use. I'm going to scroll all the way down to, let's see, what looks interesting here. Maybe games and comics. What would be a good one here? Oh, okay, that's cool. Let's do a Pokemon API. So this is a public and free to use API called the Poke API. And what it does is you can make some requests to the server and it'll return you back some information about a Pokemon. So right on the homepage here, it actually gives you a little example URL that you can use. So let's go ahead and copy that. I'm going to hit this little copy to clipboard button. And then I'm going to go over to my Postman. And then in Postman, if you've never seen it before, all you need to do to get started working with it is you hit workspaces. I'm going to go to my workspace. It's going to load. And then you can create a new collection. So I'm going to create a new blank collection. I'm going to call this Poke API. I'm going to delete the other one so you guys don't get confused. And then now that we have this collection, we can start creating some requests to this API. So I'm just going to hit this add a request button. And then I'm going to just paste in that URL I copied from over on this page right here. And then I can just hit send. That's going to send that request. And then it's going to return me back that data. So just taking a quick look here, this is JSON like we talked about earlier. Looks like we have a list of the abilities. So I just requested for a Ditto. I wanted information about Ditto. So we have a list of Ditto's abilities. Let's see if we can find something that's not too complicated. The height, any items that Ditto can hold, and a bunch of other good stuff. Yeah, so that's just a really quick example of like hitting an API and just getting information about something specific like a Ditto. But what if now I wanted to maybe grab the first 10 Pokemon in the Pokédex order, right? How could I do that? Well, what I'm going to do, because I don't know how to do this, is I'm going to check out the docs. All APIs that you'll use will have some sort of documentation that tell you all the URLs that you can use to interact with those, with the API. And so if you're ever like, what can I do with this API? The first place you want to look is the documentation. So I'm going to scroll down. Let's see. Okay, a resource list. So I want a list of Pokemon. So that's probably what I want. Okay, and it looks like just reading this here, by default, a list page will contain up to 20 resources. Okay, so let's just try that. So it looks like all I need to do is just say I want API/v2/Pokemon, and this should just give me back 20 Pokemon. And then looking here in the results part of the API or of the response, we have one, looks like about 20, right? So we have all of our Pokemon that we requested, and that's great. But now I only want 10 Pokemon. How can I do that? Well, again, I'm going to go to the docs. I'm going to take a look here. And it looks like it says, if you would like to change this, just add a limit query parameter to the GET request. For example, $limit equals 60. Okay. So it looks like on this API, I can specify a query parameter, and a query parameter is just some extra information that you give to the API to tell it what you want to do, right? So to specify I'm writing a query parameter, I'm going to do a question mark, and then I'm going to say limit, and then however many I want, equals 10, because I only want 10. And now it looks like I only got back 10, but it's hard to tell the difference between 10 and 20. So let's say I just want 1. I'll send that. And yeah, I just got back 1. So that's a really, really brief. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So when you're doing the API, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I still don't even know, right? Like, what goes 3,000 in the past, right? Because that essentially do the same thing you should communicate with that file that I have on the 3,000.
Exactly. So yeah, if you've made an API before, like in your task for your project, yeah, you'll have like a path, and then that's what you would actually hit on the website to access that specific API endpoint is what it's called.
That was so confusing.
Yeah, no, I feel you. Hopefully that clears some stuff up. But yeah. Okay, so that's a super quick introduction to APIs. We'll look at how we can use those in React in a minute when Alex does a demo. But before we get into that, one last thing I want to show you guys is a little bit on JavaScript, and it's the map function. My team will recognize this from last Wednesday. So to show you guys this, I'm going to just do an interactive example, and you guys can ask questions as they come up. So to do that, I just want to play around with JavaScript, and in order to do that, I can just come into a console or a terminal, and I can just type node, and now I can start writing JavaScript, and it'll spit it back out and do run it for me. So first, what does the map do? Map will essentially iterate over an array and perform some sort of operation on it, and then return a new array where each element had that operation performed on it. But what does that mean? Let's look at an example. First, I'm going to define a function. So I'm going to say function add double, and then that function is going to take one parameter. I'll call that num. It's going to take in a number, and pretty simple stuff. All this is going to do is it's going to return number times 2. Right? Let's just test that it works real quick. Double, 2, 4. Perfect. Now let's say I have an array, right? I'm going to define an array. And it's just an array of 4 elements, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I want to get a new array that has each of these elements doubled, right? So 1 will be 2, 2 will be 4, and so on. The map function lets you do this, okay? So in order to do this, I'm going to get const new array equals array dot map. And then I'm going to pass in the function that I want to be applied to each element, right? So what map is doing is it's going to go to each element in this list. It's going to start at 1. It's going to say, okay, the function that was passed in, I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to say that's the new element at this spot, or that's the new number at this spot. Then it's going to go to the next one, do the same thing, call the function, whatever's returned from that function, that's the new number at this spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass into this map function the double function, just like we were doing with useEffect, where we're passing functions around. And then I'm going to close that out. And now I can show you guys new array, and it's what we were expecting, 2, 4, 6, 8. You might also see this not where you define a function and then pass that in. You might see a different syntax that looks something like this. I'm going to call this new array 2 equals array.map. And instead of passing in the double function, I'm going to define what's called an anonymous function, which is essentially just a function without a name. And I'm going to say this function. So let's look at the syntax here. In order to define an anonymous function, I'll do parentheses to say this is a function, some arrows, and then I'll put the function body in between the curly braces. But for this function, we're actually going to be passing in each element of the array as we're going through it, right? So the function that we pass in needs to take in a parameter. So we'll call that parameter num. Do the arrow to say I'm going to start writing my function, curly brace, and then I can do the same thing I did up here where I did return num times 2. Close that out. So that curly brace will end the function, and then I'll do a closing parentheses to close this part right here. And now new array 2 should be the same thing, right? All we did that time is we gave it an anonymous function, which is again, just a function without a name, instead of first declaring the function and then passing it in. And one thing I want to point out to you guys, let's give me some space, is that the map function doesn't actually modify the original array at all. So if I print out this array, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4. It just gave us a new array where each element is doubled. Okay, any questions about the map function? That's a little confusing. All you need to know is that for each element in an array, it'll do some operation, do some function, and then whatever's returned by that function is the new element in that position in a new array. Any questions?
So two things I want to just emphasize really quickly. You'll see here we have double parentheses, num, curly braces. Here we have parentheses, but no name, because an anonymous function is just a function without a name. Then we have this extra arrow here just to say, here's the function, and then we still have the curly braces. So it's pretty much the exact same. This just doesn't have a name. And then what this is doing is it'll call double 1, double 2, double 3, double 4 right there. And here we just specify it's saying 1 times 2, 2 times 2, 3 times 2, 4 times 2. And that is what gets us this output. By the way, that might not notice it.
Yeah. And I will also add one more thing. This arrow is an equal sign and then a greater than sign. So that's, that's what the arrow looks like. Okay, so that's all for me. If there are no questions about map or APIs or useEffect, I'll pass it over to Alex, who's going to use everything we just talked about to build a cool little demo.
Yeah, so a few guys at my dev meeting last week, or I guess on Wednesday, said that it would be nice if you could actually code along with the demos. So I went ahead and kind of built a little template. I put it in the Discord. I don't know if any of you actually pulled it down, but I did one. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm being dumb or something.
Yeah.
Can't clone. Whenever I clone the repository, it's only week 3 and nothing past that.
Yeah, no. Well, let's see. So that is a thing with branches. Were you able to try and change branches, or?
I might have just done it wrong. All I tried was going directly into, I went to the lesson 4 branch, and whenever I go to actually clone it, it just clones the week 3 and nothing else.
Yeah, no. So yeah, it's a little confusing because the main branch actually only has the week 3, and I actually don't even know if there's any material in the week 3 thing either. So it is confusing. I was going to show you guys actually how we go ahead and do that and get the actual stuff for this week. Let's see. Let's go to repositories. Web workshop. Cool. So, has anyone that wants to code along not pulled the repository down yet and cloned it? It doesn't matter. I'm going to clone it anyway, so don't know why I've really bothered. So, Xavier, how do you switch windows on this thing? Alt tab. Sweet. There it is. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and open a new window of this, just fresh. And then I have this clone repository thing here. I can just paste that URL right in there and clone from that. And then documents junk. I was about to ask you.
Oh, maybe home/junk.
Home junk. There it is. Cool. That's just where the folder is going to sit. And I'm just going to open it here. And yeah, this is what you saw, right? Is just the week 3. So let's see if I can make this bigger. Can you guys see this all right? Anything blocking it or in the way? Wish it's so far down there. So, and make this smaller. Can you guys see this main thing right here on your screens? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you click on it, what you'll see is a bunch of things that pop up right here. You have origin / origin just means, just think of it as like the home point. It doesn't really matter. But you can click on any of these to switch to them. And if you click on lesson 4 or lesson 4 template, that should switch you over. And then now you should be able to see the week 4 content. I might have actually missed that step in the Discord thing. So yeah, sorry about that, guys. So now what we want to do is actually, get this up and running. So I'm going to pull up a new terminal window. Cool. So I've got a window. And you can see here that I'm just in the lesson 4 template folder. That's where we want to be, is just, or the lesson 4 template branch, and we're in the web dev workshop folder. So if we look at what is in that folder right here, we can see we have these files and then the week 3 and week 4. We're on week 4. So in your terminal, if you write the cd or change directory command, you can go into week 4. And then now we can see that we are in this week 4 folder, and that is where all of the code for this week is. So now you can see the actual project is there. All this stuff listed here is just the same stuff that's listed right here on this side. So what we want to do is get this running. So I'm going to go ahead and just clear this. So if we run the command npm install, it's just going to install anything that's necessary to run this. All right, we're looking good. Any issues on that? I know that command can error every now and then, but cool. And then to actually run it, we can do npm run dev. And dang, dude, your laptop is way faster than mine with this. We can actually see that it gave us this URL, and we can just navigate to that URL. And it will pull up. And this is the text that you should see. It's just a blank text that I wrote there. And if we look at the window manager, or what? Oh, it says something, I know. So we can actually go to the app thing, and this hello React is what's being displayed. Nothing new here. But what we want to do is Xavier just showed you guys how we can use Postman to use APIs. But how do we actually go about doing that inside of an application? Before I move on, is anyone not at this point that wants to be? Cool. Moving forward, gonna move this down. So what we want to do is we're just going to write a simple application just to show you guys that we can make a request to that API for, a Pokemon, and we can actually display that onto the page. And it's just going to show you guys how these things interact inside of an application. So first things first, I wrote a component already called Pokemon. Just a very simple component ready to be imported. Just takes in a name as its parameters. And we can actually go ahead and in our app file, go ahead and actually what I'm going to do is just write Pokemon here, and I'm going to give it a name. I'll say Pikachu. That's in the thing. Cool. Make sure we import this. Import Pokemon. Cool. Now if we save this, yep. we can now see that we're displaying a list item. If you remember the HTML, we're displaying a list here. And the list item is just the name of the Pokemon, Pikachu. Now what we want to do is get this name of the Pokemon from the API. I guess before I move on, any issues with this? Cool. So what we want to do is in our app, let's just say when we load the page, we want to say, all right, let's just get a list of Pokemon. First thing we want to do when we load the page. Well, to do that, I'm just going to write a function just called get Pokemon. Get Pokemon. Just like that. And what we can do is I'm just going to do a simple console.log just to make sure that we can use this function properly. Just say hello. Now, Xavier was kind enough to show us what we can do if we want to get something to just run once on page load. And when I say page load, that's just the first time that this component or this app component, which is the page, gets displayed. And to do that, I'm going to use the useEffect function that he showed us, right? I actually need to do this below. Actually, I don't know if you need to do that in JavaScript or not, but I'm going to do it below anyway. So just going to define this here. Oh, it is the wrong one. Yeah. Let's see. And then I'm just going to write useEffect, pass in that function, the get Pokemon function, and then that empty array from earlier. So now what this should do is make sure on your guys' computers that you have imported useEffect up here. Mine automatically did it for me, which is nice, but just make sure, or else you might get an error. We go ahead and save this, load this here, and then if we actually pull up the console where it will log it, you can see it displayed hello. There's no state here to show that it's going to not reload anytime like he showed you earlier. You already know that. But just to show you that as we refresh the page, that's the first thing that gets run. That's exactly what we want. So let's go back to our app. Any issues so far? Cool. So what we want to do is we want to go make a request to that API. Now, to do that in JavaScript, what we do is I'm going to define a new variable. And I'm going to call this response, right? We're making a request to the API and we're going to get a response back. So I'm going to make a response and I'm going to use this fetch function. Fetch is just saying fetch this for me or retrieve it. And then I need to actually get the API URL, which is here. And then to the home page. Yeah, just on this one. Yeah, there it is. So we can basically just say, this is kind of representing what Xavier just did in Postman, where we're just saying, go retrieve this. We're using that HTTP request. To use Andrew's analogy, this is similar to telling the waiter what you want off of the menu, right? We're asking for ditto off of the menu. Right, what an interesting, what? Yeah, just a little purple blob. So, now if you remember from the first week where we went over TypeScript and we threw those fancy words asynchronous and synchronous at you, and you might have been wondering, well, when do those really come into play? It's right here, right? It's going to take, we don't know how long it's going to take for that API to give us anything back. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't move forwards before that has not finished yet. So what we have to do is we're going to wait on it. Now, we get an error here because this function now needs to be an asynchronous function. Cool. Now, we have this thing down here saying that we're trying to call an asynchronous function into useEffect. And this is where that anonymous function that Xavier just showed us is, where we can do the open and closing parentheses, and then our arrow. And then we can just call our get Pokemon function like this. And then we're back and we're all good again. So is this all cool with everyone? Is everyone at this point? Sweet. Now we can do this. We compile with no errors. We just have a warning saying this variable is never used. So now, if we actually log this data or this response to see what it looks like and go back to that page, and open this console again, we can see that instead of, or we didn't remove the hello, yes? Might have kept that there. Okay, yeah, I did remove it. So we can see we get this response back. And if you recognize this from a second ago, this is actually JSON data. And we can see that we have all of this good stuff, but we want to make sense of this, right? Well, we don't want any of this weird HTTP nonsense, right? What we want is the actual Pokemon from it. So if we go back to our VS Code, what we can do is create a new variable where we're just going to get the data from it. And we have to await this as well, because this operation takes time, where we're going to get our response.json. Now, and instead of logging the response, if we actually log the data and save that and refresh, now we get what Xavier was able to pull up in Postman, where we have Ditto's abilities, the forms, the game indices, all the stuff, its moves. But what we want is we want a list of Pokemon. Just like we were doing earlier, we can actually do the same thing with a query parameter, right? This is that exact same URL structure. So we can write limit equals 10, and we can do the same thing and see how the result changed. And now this is the result that Xavier was able to get. We have our results thing here with a count of 10. We just have 10 elements and we got 10 Pokemon back. And just to show you that this is in fact doing what we want it to, you guys don't have to do this, but I'll change it to 20 and save that. And then now we can see on the new one, let me open it. That the count of this results array is 20. So we're getting 20 Pokemon back from this. So that's perfect. Any issues so far? Is everyone getting this? Any problems? Cool. So now, if we want to just display a list of Pokemon, what we want to do is actually have an array of the Pokemon that we got from the API and just iterate over it and print out all of them, basically. So what we can do is actually combine a few of the things we've learned from earlier. So what we can do is actually use useState. So we'll do useState, and then we'll have Pokemon. Oh my God, dude. Yeah. And we'll have Pokemon, and then set Pokemon equals useState. Now, we're using TypeScript. And what TypeScript does is it likes its types. And so what you have to do to specify that you're getting an array of these Pokemon is actually use these angle bracket notation. But before I even do that, is we have to actually define an interface from what we want to get from each Pokemon. Because if you remember, each Pokemon had a number of different things. It has a name, it has the game it's in, it has a list of the moves that it has. For the sake of simplicity, we're just going to take its name, Pokemon, and we'll give it a name of a string. or type of string. I'm gonna change that name so we don't get an issue there. Pokemon data. Looking good. Cool. So that is now the type of data that we want to get for each kind of Pokemon that we got back from that API call. So what we can do is say that in our use state, so we're basically saying that this Pokemon variable right here, we're telling TypeScript what type we want to make this. So we want to make that our Pokemon data type. And since we're trying to get multiple back and we don't know how many that is, we want to make this an array. And the way you do that is you just add these empty brackets at the end of it to say that this is a Pokemon array. And then we close that off, and then we can finish this here. And just to make sure, useState likes to take an initial value to set it, so if this was a number, we might want to set it to 0 to start. In this case, it's just going to be an empty array. And we can end the line there. What's that error? Oh, it's not imported. Yeah. So want to make sure we import useState from React as well. And now we actually have now set up a variable that can store all of the data that we got back from the API call and display it onto the page. So if we look back here, we have this results. And this is the list of Pokemon that we get. So this results thing from the actual response, or the response data, the results is what we want to get the Pokemon from. So we can go back and we can now actually, let's see, set our Pokemon to our data.results. Does not like that.
Pokemon's missing an E and set Pokemon in the definition.
Oh, you're right. Long day. Cool. Yeah. So now what we've done is just to recap, we sent a request to retrieve some Pokemon. We then turned that Pokemon into some data that we can then see and use. Now what we're doing is putting that data into a variable here that we can then display on the page down here in our app component. So the next step is we actually want to display that data. So Xavier just showed you a really handy function that iterates over an array and then returns a new one. And that function is a map. And since our Pokemon state variable for useState is an array, we can do the exact same thing there. And we can return an array of any value that we want. So what we can do is just set this up. We'll put a UL here for unordered list, just for the outer wrapper. You say something? The UL, yeah. So now what we want to do is write some code inside of some HTML. And this is where we have to use this weird notation with our curly brackets. If you remember where if we want to use the useState variable inside of a component or something, you have to put the curly braces around it. This is essentially the same thing going on, where if you say you want to use some code, you always need to use some curly brackets. So what we can do is then make or map through our Pokemon array. So we're going to do dot map. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is we have to, nice circle, Xavier. We have to write an anonymous function, just like we've done a few times, just like this. Now, what we want to do is actually pass something into this anonymous function. And if you remember Xavier's example, where he was able to write an anonymous function, he had to pass in the number. So it's just that current number that it was at in the array. We're going to do the same thing with Pokemon. We're going to pass in the Pokemon, each Pokemon that's in the Pokemon state variable or the state array. So I'm going to write, what's a good name for a current Pokemon is what we're going to be passing in. And let's say for each one of these, we want to return one of our Pokemon components. And we're going to give it a name, and it's going to be current Pokemon dot name, just like that. And essentially, just to say what this is doing, is saying our state variable Pokemon is an array. We're going to go through each Pokemon in that array. And for that, we're going to create a brand new Pokemon component with its name. Now, if we save that, oh, thank God, it actually worked. You can now see that we have 20 Pokemon in Pokedex order that we have gotten from the API. So that's actually how you can go get data from an API and use it in part of your application. This is a very simple example, but think about the YouTube example that we did last week, where I made a component for a video and you could pass in parameters and customize it. But what we want to do, if you were actually YouTube, is be able to say any number of videos on your homepage, right? Anytime you refresh your homepage, you might get a different kind of video. And what they're doing is essentially, in principle, the same thing as we're doing here. They're just going to get an array of data from that YouTube videos are stored in, and they're going to display an array of YouTube videos, basically. And it's essentially the same thing. Yeah. Cool. Any questions about that? Any issues that anyone ran into? Oh, yeah. So this is where that query parameter is really nice. So if we change this to 50, hopefully that's not too ambitious. Yeah, now we get a lot more Pokemon here. And it's automatic. Yeah, right. Like last time I had to write 3 video components and pass in individual things each time. On this, what I was able to do is just get a collection of data and just make this. And this doesn't matter what number we choose. It could be 1, it could be 50, it could be 200, and it'll just create 200 Pokemon for us, 100 Pokemon for us, any number that we want. And that's really the beauty of being able to use map and different types of arrays and just good ways of using data and information that we've got. So yeah, anything to add, Andrew? Go for it, man. Yep.
So just kind of start to finish overview. Get rid of this guy.
The terminal. Okay, I was like, the code? Yeah.
Get rid of this terminal, yeah. There we go, you can see all the code. All right. So we have this function app. This contains all of the content that's on the page. When this function is ran, stuff gets put onto the page. Whatever's inside of this useEffect, in this case it's a function, this function will run once and once only, and that's when stuff is put on the page for the first time. So it'll only run once. And what this does is it goes and hits this API from the client. That URL is the API. That API is going to some central Pokemon database and getting all the Pokemon that we want, giving it back to the API, and the API gives it back to us in this response variable. And this response variable isn't changing, so we have it called const. Then we make that into a more readable format by putting .json on that. And both of these things take an unknown amount of time, and it involves like some data interactions. And so we tack in a wait in front of that just to say, hey, I want to wait before moving on. Wait until that line of code finishes executing. Because I put an await there, I have to put an async right there. That's just how it is. You can add on to that bit. If you use an await, you have to have that async. And then the next thing we do is up here we have this use state. This use state has 2 things. It has our Pokemon, which has all of the Pokemon that we currently have. That's kind of a redundant statement. And then we have this set Pokemon function. Whenever we call this set Pokemon function, it will update the value of our Pokemon. And because we have this array of Pokemon data here, this Pokemon variable is an array of objects, JSON, that have a name that is a string. And so down here, we call this set Pokemon function, which has the results of our data from the API. And so that updates this Pokemon variable with all of the Pokemon that we got back from the API. Now that this has changed, this will automatically update. This map function basically says for every Pokemon in this array of Pokemon, return a new component with that Pokemon's name. So if we have 5 Pokemon, it has 5 components where name is Pokemon 1, name is Pokemon 2, and so on and so forth. And then if we go into the Pokemon component, if we have the 5 Pokemon, this is what function is being ran 5 times because we have 5 Pokemon. And again, when we run a function with something that looks a bit like HTML, that will then display on the page. So when we run this function 5 times, it will display that Pokemon's name 5 different times for each of our Pokemon. And that's everything we just did in such a short time. That's cool.
Yeah. One thing I do want to add is if we remember that big JSON thing that we got of each Pokemon, there's a lot more than just the name that we got here. I just only want to use the name, so that's what I defined right here. Let's say if I wanted to get an array of the moves that it has, I would define a whole new data type and have to put that in there. But that stuff gets kind of complex pretty quick, and for the sake of time and simplicity, we don't want to do that. But it has like an ID and like a Pokedex ID or whatever. If you could put that in there, and it would just be a number, and then we could display both the number and the name. So right, we're kind of just picking and choosing what fields for each Pokemon that we want to display. I just want to add because I did not touch on that when I first wrote it. Cool.
Any questions? Did anyone follow along the whole way?
Let's go.
Sweet, awesome. My team, we're not doing the overview today. We're gonna do it a different time. So thanks, guys. If you have any other questions, you can come and talk to us. We'll stick around for like 5 to 10 minutes.
Remember, Portal, can you both hang around for just 2 seconds? That's one thing. All right, I'm sorry. You had a question? No.
Forgot to do the recording.
Did we just not record? Stop recording. Oh, there it is.